The Path of Totality by Richard L. Elsliger. Copyright 2022. I was 4 years old that summer day when I invited my best friend Monica outdoors to play, a day that has never faded from the purview of my memory, a memory that has persisted into my advanced years. Now as I sit here in my twilight years, it visits me more often, a hellish somnium of my mind. This reoccurring vision I am unable to escape, a vision of horror that I am unable to banish. But you see, it wasn't a simple nightmare, a passing phantasm of that imagination, because such encounters would disappear in daylight, vaporize into the ether of atoms from whence they came. What I am about to tell for all those who will listen happens to be more than nightmare, it happens to be truth. I will do my best to narrate my account of that day, given my old age, if you will take the time to hear a thing most outlandish. I grew up on Haslam Street, a middle-class neighborhood mixture of blue-collar and white-collar workers. The town isn't important. What happened is, though I might say that what transpired on that street would be a thing beyond the scope of human understanding, an event beyond all reason of natural law. What happened that afternoon robbed me of my childhood, robbed me of my best friend, and then later stole my sanity. I woke up early that day, a Saturday as I recall, because I distinctly remember watching a series of cartoons before heading out the door to play. My version of play at the time was displaying my pedaling skills on a choice ride, my cherished tricycle. The brand escapes me now, but I do recall the flashy red paint and streamers on the handlebars, such special frills that distinguished me from my peers and made me the talk of the street. It was my first hot rod, shall I say. As I matured, tricycles gave way to bicycles, and bicycles yielded to high horsepower cars of various kinds, but I digress. The street where I lived was a dusty, crumbling reminder of suburban decay, a reminder that nothing lasted forever. The poor condition of Haslam Street reached a boiling point that summer when several neighbors, to include my parents, complained to the town and demanded with vociferous voices that the road be fixed. Potholes had reached a prolific point, bending rims and eating the occasional car, depending on its size. The weathered pavement that summer had waged an undeclared, all-out war against any vehicle or bicycle that dared challenge the asphalt of Haslam Street. To us kids, when the inevitable torrential downpour struck, those craters filled to the brim, turning them into fishing holes big enough to swim across, not in the literal sense, of course, but big enough to garner the ire of our parents. "Don't drive on Haslam," they said. "We have potholes as big as fishing holes." That was the popular expression of the day, a sordid joke to diffuse the simmering anger over the state of disrepair. The dilapidated asphalt was a disgrace and reflected poorly on the neighborhood, so the residents assembled in front of City Hall one afternoon under the blazing sun, and they dumped piles of broken asphalt on the steps to the mayor's office. That drew the attention of the mayor, who, upon further review, determined that a fix was needed if he was to stay in office. Word traveled fast, and before long, the whole community knew about the awful condition of Haslam Street, and many drove to see the spectacle for themselves. My adult self can only suppose that the town was financially challenged at the time because a complete resurfacing wasn't ever going to happen. A patchwork crew was sent instead, and they applied what was known as a cold patch to fill the potholes. The cold patch was nothing more than a rude mixture of gravel and asphalt, carefully dumped into the offending depression without the application of heat. The curing period, I was told in retrospect, took on average a full month to solidify. The fix was quick and dirty, but it quelled any further disturbances by the inhabitants of our street. There was one particular patch, though, a single solitary patch at the end of our dead-end street that didn't conform to the others. It was tar-based, as one might expect, yet bubbled in the hot afternoon sun, unlike the surrounding cold patches that remained inert. Monica and I liked to visit the renegade patch, and we would break the bubbles with our fingers, getting the pungent oily substance all over ourselves. It was great fun for a pair of 4-year-olds with nothing better to do in our young lives other than to engage in the most pedestrian of activities during the long, lazy summer hiatus. Summer provided a suitable buffer away from the looming prospect of entering kindergarten. Those lazy summers went on forever and gave us a pleasant reprieve from the threat of school life for the next 12 years or more. Monica and I discussed our fear of kindergarten with all of its imagined threats, those impossible assignments and angry teachers meting out punishments for the slightest deviation away from the school curriculum. We stressed about hypothetical failures to understand homework on subjects we might never understand or ever need to understand in our simple lives. The cold patch became our spot of commiseration. So many years have piled on to this rickety frame, yet I can never forget Monica. She was my first friend, and I adored her as my closest companion. Her hair hung in braids, and her eyes were possessed of a brilliant blue spark that captivated my young mind. I imagined one day I would marry this girl and we would live out our blissful dream, but that dream was not to be. Monica never started school with me that early autumn. She was taken away. I have no other way to articulate what happened or why, but I will do my very best. That summer day, I invited Monica to a tricycle race. She protested at first and expressed concern where we might have this race. I suggested the road, of course, the potholes having been filled by the city, imperfect though they were, made the street serviceable once more. She said that the road was no good, that the street surface was nowhere close to level in places. I countered, stating that the sidewalk was too narrow for two tricycles side by side. At least on the road, we weren't going to be swallowed alive by massive craters anymore. I teased her about hungry potholes coming to eat her, and she told me to stop the silliness. I tell this story from an adult perspective, so please forgive my elaborate language. I only use such words to describe these events because I am old, and my childish language is far behind me in the rearview mirror. Let me assure you that my 4-year-old brain had no experience with such lofty words and descriptions. I can only relate the story as I remember it. I narrate from an elder point of view. Remembering that day, Monica acquiesced to my insistence, and we made a plan to start the race using our favorite pothole as the reference point. She skipped to her house while I waited on the sidewalk, poised on my tricycle, my mind focused to set a world record. Minutes later, she pedaled her ride to meet me. The sun highlighted her fair hair, and her face gave off a ruddy glow. I was in love as much as a 4-year-old could understand the meaning of love. I led the way to our distinguished pothole, and Monica cheered with an enthusiasm that has never faded from me, but rather has stretched across time to still haunt me today. The high sun beat down upon us in the early afternoon sky. The wind picked up and stirred dust devils at the side of the road. I stopped and pointed to a candy wrapper that swirled in concentric turns, headed skyward in a mini vortex of dust and detritus. I told Monica to watch it fly, and together we marveled at the flash of foil disappear into the sky. I mused that the wrapper had ascended to heaven, and we moved on. We reached the end of our street and came to a stop next to the filled hole. Tar bubbles dotted the periphery of the patch, and we kneeled down to break a few. The tar crackled under pressure, and the sharp, acrid odor of curing asphalt filled our senses. I took a look down the street and saw no activity, automotive or otherwise, and I suggested to Monica that we make our run now. She agreed, and we took positions for a standing start. I drove my tricycle over the patch and squatted, ready to blaze across the unimpeded road. I wanted to start from the pothole, thinking that the sticky tar might give me more traction. Monica looked at me with a puzzled gaze and asked why I chose to use a sticky tar patch for the start. I wanted to conceal the unfair advantage, to use the sticky tar for added traction, giving me a better launch, but you see, I loved Monica in my own childish way, and I told her my intent. Out of a profound sense of guilt, I offered to give her the patch instead, and she accepted. We switched places with our tricycles, Monica taking her ride over the cold patch, and me taking her place over the weathered asphalt, a decision that torments me to this day. It was at that instant that the weather turned cold. Monica looked at me with bewildered eyes, and all I could do was return her questioning display with a look of equal confusion. We stood there, two tricycles ready to go, captivated by the sudden deviation, not only in temperature, but in ambient light. Our parents had warned us not to stare at the sun, but the sun was vanishing before our eyes. I can assure all concerned that it was nothing like anything our young minds had ever encountered. The sun began to disappear by degrees, a solar eclipse. Monica asked me if we were in trouble, and as I reflect upon her question now, yes, we were deeply in trouble. I could only allay her concern and say that this was nothing dangerous, but just a weird cloud in the sky that would soon go away. Truth be told, I was scared. The tricycle race vanished from consideration, and we observed in horror while that big cloud devoured the sun. It never entered our minds that a phenomenon such as a solar eclipse could even exist. I still have minor retinal damage from that day, not knowing at the time that staring at a solar eclipse could lead to blindness. The sun went back for reasons I could not at the time comprehend, and it was at that time when I noticed a slight shift on the back wheel of Monica's tricycle. It dipped and sank into the cold patch. Before I could utter a word of warning, the entire front end of her ride was consumed in what I can only describe as a swirling whirlpool of liquid blackness. The cold patch no longer resembled tar, but a dark and foreboding gateway to another realm, to another dimension of space and time as I reflect upon this event decades later. Monica screamed at the unexpected onslaught of what I now believe was a rip in the fabric of time or space, maybe both. Whether her scream was in pain or fear, I, to this day, cannot determine. My reflexes were fast, the best they would ever be, and I, Reginald Walker, pushed off from my tricycle to help dear Monica. I pulled on her handlebars. I tried with all my strength, believing that my childlike grasp would be enough to extricate her with ease, along with the tricycle. My hand slipped and I fell backwards for my efforts. I sat up to see that Monica was already submerged to her waist in the muck and mire of this monstrosity that only moments before was a static and non-threatening cold patch. The voracious thing was taking her away, and I was losing the window of opportunity. I recovered and ran to her, seizing upon her shoulders, but the thing would not let her go. She pleaded with me. She begged me to save her. I gave maximum effort, but again lost my grip. She sank into the void, now up to her neck. I can still see with great clarity the image of terror etched upon her face, the wild look of impending death in her eyes before she completely submerged into the pit. The sun reappeared by degrees, and the pit solidified. I wailed and howled like a crazed animal, unable to understand what just happened. When I was found by a neighbor, the eclipse had passed, and so had Monica. In the following hours, I explained what I saw, what I experienced, but as you might imagine, no one believed me. I took them to the spot of her disappearance, but all they found was a cold patch and nothing more. The adults demanded that I tell the truth of what happened to Monica. I could not believe that they thought I was responsible for her disappearance. Then the detectives arrived with their vigorous questions and insulting accusations. They asked me where I hid the body. I protested my innocence as best as any 4-year-old could muster, and I kept to my story, the truth of what I saw. In the end, they found no body, and with no body there could be no crime. They attributed my story to a coping mechanism, a coded explanation by a child to describe what in all probability amounted to a kidnapping. The adults likened my bizarre story to a rationalization, a means to mask the stress of a frightful encounter. In the end, the detectives realized that my window of time to spirit the body away, to hide Monica, did not make sense, and they stopped hounding me with their ridiculous interrogations. But that did not prevent the knowing glances from neighbors that suggested I had something to do with her disappearance. I frequently visited the cold patch after the horror, and I cried. I would call for Monica to come back. I would beg her for a sign to show me that she was okay, that she might come back to me someday. On occasion, the wind would blow my hair while I stood and stared at the patch. I thought it might be Monica's attempt to communicate to me, to tell me in her own way that she was alive, waiting to be released. I would test the patch, jump on it, pound on it with a shovel, and on one occasion attempt to dig down, but the tar resisted all of my efforts. It refused to give up its secrets, presenting nothing more than a hardened old patch of asphalt. My parents saw my obsession and distress. It wasn't too long before they made the decision to take me away from this nightmare, and so it happened. We moved away to a town far away from the memory of Haslam Street and the memory of Monica. I never returned to Haslam Street as I expected I might in later years, but the memory of that street, of that day, never left my mind. No one ever saw Monica again, and she went into a cold case file, but for me it was more a cold patch than a cold case, if I may say. I grew older, perhaps wiser, and though separated by distance and time, I never truly moved away from that day. I never married, never settled down, and somehow, some way, I held hope that one day Monica would come back, that somehow she would re-enter my life and we could settle down and put the nightmare behind us. That day never came, but as the years passed, I had time to reflect, to remember, to mentally reconstruct all of the events that led to that fateful moment in time. I vowed one day I would come back, and I did. Now I stand once more on Haslam Street and wait. The cold patch remains, a pock-marked old depression, but still recognizable after all those decades. What surprises me most is that the old street was never resurfaced, but then again, not much has changed when it came to general maintenance on good old Haslam Street. The sun beats down on me and I pace in the general area, dressed in casual garb, and tried my best not to look conspicuous. Initially I fear that I might be recognized, that Reginald Walker came back to the scene of his crime, but no one notices. The former residents of Haslam are long since dead, and their offspring have long since moved. No one truly stays on Haslam for any length of time. I check the sky and observe the beautiful faint blue of a cloudless day. I check the time. If my calculations are correct, I will be standing within the umbral shadow directly along the Path of Totality, just as it was so many decades ago. It will soon be upon me. I have waited my whole life for this moment and will have little time to do what needs to be done. A chill begins to permeate the air, and the radiant warmth of the sun dims toward blackness. The wind stirs, and I maneuver myself to stand in front of the cold patch. I can see the sharpening of my shadow on the asphalt, and then the light turns to twilight. I now stand inside Totality and can see Venus above me, along with the stars of the Milky Way. The sun looks like a black hole edged with a bright coronal flare through my special lenses, and that is when the cold patch begins to liquefy. It softens and swirls as it did from decades ago. I kneel before the viscous asphalt and close my eyes, then plunge my arm into the black depths. The sensations are not molten as I feared, but rather cool and pleasant. Deeper, my arm delves into the murky depths until I feel the grasp of a hand upon mine. The hand is soft, delicate, and warm. I hang on tight and I pull. Whatever happens this time, I will never let go.